All right, let's dive into Hosea. Here you go. Here's everything you need to know about Hosea. Any questions?
Can you read that?
So this actually comes from the Bible Project's 7-minute video on Hosea, which we will watch at some point, and then they will zero in and you will see this, and then I will cut them and use them in slides and stuff. So it's just a title slide now, but you get the general idea. Hosea has 3 parts. The first 3 chapters are all we're really going to dive into in detail, and then we'll mention a couple of other things. But today we're going to just start the who, what, when, where, and why of Hosea, and the what in particular. Some of the when is going to overlap with Micah and Amos in particular, so we're not going to have to rehash that more than just today when we get to the next 2 minor prophets that we talk through. So, who? Hosea. Chapter 1, verse 1 says, "The word of the Lord came to Hosea, son of Beeri." Beeri is how English white Anglo-Saxon tongues typically pronounce it, but those are 2 separate vowels in Hebrew. Okay. Beyond this, we just don't know anything about the guy. We know his wife's names. We know his children's unfortunate names, depending on what chapter you're in. In chapter 3, they seem to turn into fortunate names, and we'll talk about the wordplay around their names. But other than this, we don't really know too much about the guy personally. And that will be the case for most of the prophets. We just don't know a whole lot of their background. We can surmise certain things about certain ones. Like I've mentioned, Ezekiel, maybe even Jeremiah were probably of priestly class. Ezekiel in particular seems like he was definitely trained as a priest, but taken into exile before he ever got to act as a priest, because he writes about very specific temple things that really only the priest knew in that detail. So you can surmise certain things if you understand culture, background, language, and really read closely. But not with a guy like Hosea. You just can't do it. There's just not a whole lot there. The first chapter and the 3rd chapter are the only personal chapters we even get. And they're pretty much in relation to his wife, his children, and then everything else is about the nation of Israel. So we have to know some certain things about what was happening or when he was writing and what was happening during this time period. So let's jump from who to when. Hosea's life and ministry covered a lot of the 8th century BC, which is, of course, like the 700s from 799 BC to 700 BC. He's living during that era, which is the 8th century BC, which is a little bit confusing. And I think I caught myself yesterday, correct me if I'm wrong, Steffo, any other places, where I wrote the 7th century because I was writing out 700s in certain places. And then I caught myself, wait a second, that should be the 8th century. So I corrected it on a further slide. So there you go. The 700s is the lifetime that he's living in, and it's a politically wrought lifetime, because verse 1 goes on and says, he lived and ministered, the word of the Lord came to him during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and during the reign of Jeroboam, this is Jeroboam II, son of Jehoash, or Joash, depending on how your English translations do it, king of Israel. So, these are the general timelines. They're not... Counting the reign of the kings can differ by a year and a half to 2 years. So sometimes Uzziah is like 781 to 740, depending on how you count, because they're ancient lunar calendars, and matching them up with our modern solar calendars that came much later is actually tricky. So don't take these numbers too strictly. They're probably going to be off by a year to 2 years, depending on how you count, especially because the Hebrew calendar has like 2 New Years. 2 New Years. It has like a new year in the spring and a new year in the fall. Like the school year starts around like August and September. Their planting fall festivals and stuff start around like September to October, but their new year actually starts right now in the spring. And it typically, well, depending on a different calendar, Jewish New Year is actually around the middle of September, right? The calendar year can start there, depending on which calendar you're using. So I've given you basic things, but the big thing that I want you to see are Uzziah and Jeroboam II. Because if you look at the numbers, they're overlapping pretty much. Jeroboam II is starting before Uzziah. Uzziah reigns a little bit longer than Jeroboam, but they both have very long reigns. And they're both politically stable. And then both of them die within a few years of each other, and things go a lot more chaotic in the northern kingdom of Israel. The southern kingdom of Judah stays pretty semi-stable because Jotham and Hezekiah are both good kings, except that for about 20 years, Ahaz, who's not a good king, is reigning, and so they have a lot of strife with the empire of Assyria and a few other people that we'll talk about today. So Isaiah in particular is like, come on, Ahaz, get with the program. You got to trust the Lord. Your father did it. Your son's going to do it. He doesn't say that, but it's like, if he would have known that, he would have said it. It's like, you're the odd man out here. You're the bad king. You kind of stink. Get with the program. But Jeroboam, there's no good kings in the northern kingdom of Israel. Jeroboam is just a terrible king according to the standard, but he has a lot of economic and political success for 50 years that God told him ahead of time he was going to have. Then he has it, and then when he stops having it and he goes away, like 24 years, and the northern kingdom devolves into chaos and is gone because of Assyria. So Hosea lived and ministered to God's people for a long period of time in the tumultuous era of their existence, including the Assyrian destruction and deportation of the northern kingdom in 722. Except we have to ask questions around this, but if he's going through the time of Hezekiah, which is after 722, and possibly down, we don't really know when he was born. We just know he started his ministry during the end of Jeroboam II and Uzziah's time. But we don't know when he was born, so we don't know how late into Hezekiah's time he's doing. But if the northern kingdom is gone by the time Hezekiah is king, where is he? There's no northern kingdom. And so he dates by the southern kingdoms of Judah, not the northern kingdoms. And there's a couple of good practical reasons why he would do that. Obviously, after Jeroboam II, Israel's stability as a kingdom just crumbles. 50 years of intense stability down the drain. No king of Israel is powerful for long. From 746 to 722, of about 24 years, 6 kings come and go. And that's not good. I think the longest one reigned for like maybe 6 years or something. And it's just, they're all weak, they're all wicked, no real leadership, they're all just vying for power. And so Hosea 1:1 marks time by the much more stable reigns of the kings of Judah. It was just practically a more coherent way to tell you how long he lived and ministered. But is that the only reason? Is it just more practical? Because also, Hezekiah is ministering down through the reign of Hezekiah, as I've already mentioned. We have to ask certain questions about what he did after the northern kingdom of Assyria fell. If he's living on past that time, where is he? And I'll just say, well, we're going to ask questions. We don't have the answers to them. Did Hosea move to southern Judah before or after 722, living out his life under the reigns of Ahaz and Hezekiah? Is that why we have his scripture? Is that why the southern people collected his prophecies? Is that why he marks time by the southern kings? Answer, we don't know. I already asked that question. We don't know. Such things are possible. I would say they're even very likely that he marks time by the southern kings because that's where he was by the end of his life, because it is practically more stable, but also because there is no northern kingdom, and maybe he wasn't there anymore. So, regardless of any such details, we know that Hezekiah broadly begins his ministry to Israel during the time of overlap between Uzziah in the south and Jeroboam II in the north. Technically, this could be any time between 783 and 746, but seeing as how he lives on to at least 715 when Hezekiah becomes king, the most serious scholars do not place Hezekiah's life and ministry starting so early as 783.
We need to find 2 different names for these people because you mixed the names up.
Have I? Yeah, okay. So Hosea and Hezi. No, Kai? No. See, that will actually confuse me more. You know who I'm talking about, right? So around 750 is the ballpark estimate for the beginning of his ministry, which puts him about 10 years before Isaiah in 740 to 742 when King Uzziah died, according to Isaiah 6. And he would have continued on till at least about 715. So we don't know when he was born. We don't know how old he was when he marries Gomer and becomes a prophet or anything. But the estimated length of ministry is going to be around 35 years. And it can easily be longer, but we don't know that. I would say probably no less than 35 years of life in ministry. Let's jump down to where, because looking at a map is very helpful for this. And maybe this isn't too big from your perspective, but this is a map of Israel and Judah during Hosea's time. Hosea is mostly in the northern kingdom up here, and we'll talk about the extension of the northern kingdom in just a minute, but the southern kingdom is down here. You can see it's not that big overall, but it's going to get a little bit more economic control over Philistia land in the west, Ammon, Syria and Palestine in Edom in the east, and then Damascus or Syria up here in the north. When he starts, Israel is expanding this direction. So by the time he's done, all of this is gone, and Judah will have receded slightly too because of Assyria. But you've got the Syria up here, Ammon, Edom. They're all playing power politics, and Assyria is just going to come in and be the first global empire that we'll talk about. But because Hosea is from the north and writing to the north, Hosea is unique amongst all the writing prophets because his Hebrew is actually in a northern dialect. He's actually kind of hard to read compared to if you get used to reading Micah or Amos, because despite the fact that they're from the south and minister to the north, they write in a southern dialect. As it turns out, much like America, not all Hebrew is quite the same. So everybody else is writing in that southern dialect. One thing that makes Hosea stand out if you're actually reading it in his language is that he's tricky in comparison to the South, because he's the only person we have on record who had this northern dialect from this time as far as the prophets go. So this tells us that the prophet was not only from the north, but he prophesied predominantly to the north. Again, other guys like Amos and Micah are from the south and go north to prophesy according to the word of the Lord. The superscription, as I've already mentioned, gives high priority to the kings of the south, hinting that he's definitely continuing living, but is he continuing ministering in 722? None of his prophecies that have remained and are a part of his book seem to have much to do with the kingdom of Judah after 722. They are all about the northern kingdom and the coming exile. So it's perfectly possible that he moved south. Lots of people accept the fact that lots of people from the north moved south into Judah. The prophets are telling you it's coming. Assyria's power is growing and growing and growing. Once they march on it and lay siege to Samaria for years and start conquering, where do you think the people are going to go? You can't go north anymore. You either flee to other countries that are being conquered by Assyria, or you go down south. And I see no reason why Hosea and other northern people could not have done this. So minimal that the southern kingdoms of Judah would not have actually really even noticed all that much. They're cousins, in blood, so it's not that big a deal. This is like moving from one state to another state. This is not moving from like the U.S. into Mexico or Canada or anything.
What's stopping them from going east?
Most of the east here are controlled by pagans, so technically nothing's stopping them. But once you get over here, this is all desert. So the Hebrews don't really live there. There are some desert cultures there. Babylon will conquer the desert and conquer that land. It's very fertile. There's just no water to help things grow. But no, there's no real kingdom economics there. So despite the fact that he's from the north, his book is included in the 12, which are all from the south, so some sort of southern editorial compilation took place. And into the book as we now have it, and it was likely done in Judah. It could have been done any time during or after Hezekiah's reign. The book of Hosea could have been put together during that time. However, its incorporation into one scroll of the 12 could not have been done before about 586 with the exile. So it's very likely that if Hezekiah, if you read like Proverbs or something, Hezekiah did great work trying to keep records of Proverbs and things that come from Solomon, his forefather. There's no reason not to think that he kept good records of the prophets. Isaiah's prophecies probably come to us largely through Hezekiah's work to keep these kinds of records. It's well attested that he expands Jerusalem, he expands waterways, he has building constructions, but he also has literary construction processes. So something could have begun during the time of Hezekiah, but its incorporation of the 12 and its finished form, as we have it, may not have been done until much, much later in the exile. You have to keep these things in mind. You have to weigh your options, and you have to know you're just not going to get all the answers. So we don't know. Now, more important than a lot of that is what was happening during the time of Hezekiah, Micah, Amos, and what prophecies they're making regarding the socio-political world of the Mediterranean ancient Near East. So let's talk about that. The political landscape, the whole century was just rife with change, especially the latter half of the century. Assyria emerges before the time of Hosea as this part of the world's first true and dominant world superpower. And other empires, of course, did exist. They were powerful. Egypt is a mighty empire in its own right. But when I say superpower, I'm speaking in the sense that Assyria is the first empire to really conquer the entirety of the Fertile Crescent. So I'm using it in that sense. I'm not using it in the world sense that America is the world's economic and political hegemony of imperial power today, or Rome in the New Testament. Looking at a map, Assyria as an empire is around for a long time. But Assyria's power waxes and wanes across time. They get bigger and more powerful, then they recede. Well, in 745, which is roughly the time that Jeroboam II and Jeroboam II and Uzziah, get my name straight, are both dead, Tiglath-Pileser III begins his reign, and he restarts the imperial war machine of Assyria, which means they're going to war, they're conquering, and they're expanding. And they're getting bigger and they're getting more powerful starting around 745. And they will keep going for about another 50 years down to roughly 701, a little bit beyond that. This one marks 701 because it's the time they tried to conquer Jerusalem in Isaiah and Kings, and God sends one single angel to wipe out their armies and they have to run home packing. So you can see from about 745 through the lifetime of Hezekiah down to the end of the century, they are expanding rapidly and they are conquering all these other mini empires into a first world superpower according to that day's standard. It's also important to start with Assyria for discussing this because each successive ancient Near Eastern empire would become a dominant world superpower by following their trend and conquering the entire Fertile Crescent. Babylon conquers, if Assyria is conquering like right here and setting up a world superpower, Babylon, which tries to take on Assyria and fails a couple of times, finally conquers Assyria. They take over everything and they start expanding the borders and territories. Then the Medo-Persian Empire from the east comes in and they've got all this territory of their own. They come in and they expand it all throughout basically the Red Territory throughout the time of the end of the Old Testament and the up until Alexander comes from way on this side and then takes over all of it. So the imperial structure passes from generation to generation and empire to empire. But starting from Assyria, they basically start swallowing each other up, where the purpose is to conquer the previous regime. And when you do that, you get all the land associated with it, along with anything you've previously conquered from outside their territory. So the empires get bigger and bigger until the time where you get Rome coming in from as far west as the known world went and conquering everything over to about here, so that the Mediterranean Sea was called like their pond or their lake. It was the Lake of Rome because they were the first ones to conquer all the way around the Mediterranean itself. And then further on past biblical times, they keep conquering east and east and east. So I've already mentioned this about their power waxing and waning, but it's important to understand these political things because they're affecting what's happening in little old Israel and Judah right here, these tiny little dots on the map. They are not powerful kingdoms. Solomon's time is gone, and there was the biggest imperial power that they had was during Solomon's time, and Solomon basically controlled everything right here, not all of that. And the prophets are therefore having to encourage kings to take action and do things based on what these pagan powers are doing. hey, Assyria's coming. What are you going to do? Ahaz, are you going to trust the Lord and let him give you victory, or are you going to trust in pagan powers and form alliances? And he chooses to form alliance, and his son Hezekiah will choose to trust the Lord, and Hezekiah gets the bigger win. So during the first part of the 8th century, so this is like 800 to 750, let's just ballpark it there, Assyria was relatively weak. The northern kingdom was at its strongest politically and economically. Jeroboam II takes the throne very early on. God sends the prophet Jonah, yes, that Jonah, to tell the young king that his tenure is actually going to be blessed. They're going to recover land, and they're going to have great economic prosperity. And that's the historical prophet Jonah's only recorded prophecy in the Bible. Right there in 2 Kings 14. So this is like, I don't know, this is the day of the coronation, but this is like Jeremiah's just been made king. God sends the prophet Jonah. He walks up there and he says, I got good news. In spite of your sins and the fact that you have no fear of Yahweh, you have no loyalty to him, in spite of all of that and that your kingdom has no loyalty to Yahweh anymore, God's going to bless you. He's been cursing you. You've lost so much of your land, but now God's going to bless you, and you're going to recover all the land during your reign. You're going to have peace. You're going to have prosperity because God's tired of cursing you. So now he's going to try and bless you to see if that will lead you back to him. Okay, I've just told you, Jeroboam. Go do it. And he gets up and he does it, and he gives no credit to God. He gives none whatsoever, which is why it fractures after he's done. So just a little bit of a comparative map. Before the time of King Jeroboam, you can see Israel's territory right here is relatively small. Judah's is relatively small, and they've got all these surrounding powers vying for control. And then throughout the first 50-ish years of the 8th century, Judah consolidates a lot of controlling power over Edom in the east, Philistia in the west. But Israel, you see, they collect everything all the way up. I mean, they pretty much triple their territory in land control, which when you're an agrarian society means something. You're growing a lot of food, your trade is increasing. You can, if you have mines on the lands, you can mine those places and gain metal ores for building war machines and grow militarily and stuff. So it's a big important factor to things leading up to Hosea's time. From 794 to 746, the 50-ish years of Jeroboam II, see the northern kingdom at their highest moment, while the Assyrian Empire is at one of its lowest. The situation flips upside down in the second half of the century. Jeroboam II dies, Israel unravels quickly, and Assyria rallies its imperial strength, largely on the Tiglath-Pileser III starting it off, and they just start moving towards conquering the Canaanite regions of Israel, Judah, all the way down to Egypt. Eventually they'll get to Egypt. Judah sends them home packing first on that campaign. So the decades of 750 to 700 BC see the Assyria impose a lot of imperial military power over the Canaanite region. And they are brutal. They are the absolute most brutal force of all the successive empires. They're the harshest. They would conquer you, and instead of saying, okay, let's use your people's strength, let's put you to work or something, they would conquer you, and they would make sure you knew you were conquered by nailing your people to the walls of your city and leaving them there and making sure you can't take them down. They would, what? They're Lannisters. Yeah, that's a good way to think of it if you know the Game of Thrones lore. They would, actually, they're more of, what was the guy in the north that Jon Snow fights? Ramsay Bolton. Well, Ramsay Snow. You know, he gets legitimized Ramsay Bolton. What did Ramsay Bolton do? He flayed them. Assyria would flay you, and they wouldn't just nail you to the walls of the city. They would flay you. They would nail your flayed body to the walls of the city, and then your skin next to it in the walls of the city. And they would do it. What Rome did in crucifying people, this is what Assyria did to their conquered people. It wasn't the only thing that they did, but it's probably the most graphic one that I'll mention. And they were the worst. And Babylon is a little bit kinder. Persia is a little bit kinder than Babylon. It's under Persia that everybody gets to go back to their ancestral territory, conquered either under Assyria or Babylon and stuff. And Greece has a bunch of ups and downs, but Rome, the reason that the Romans were so harsh on the Jews was because at the time in the New Testament, they're the easternmost boundary of the Roman Empire, which means to protect the boundary, you stock it full of soldiers, Roman soldiers. So they had a vested interest in controlling. So they were harsh with them, but they also made plenty of agreements that said, okay, you don't want to worship our Caesar, you want the Sabbath off, you want to worship at the temple, we'll give you certain accommodations here. Assyria gave no accommodations. You did what you were told, and that was that. Your freedom is non-existent. So, during this time, Israel allies with Syria, also known as Aram, here in the north, and it's called the Syro-Ephraimite War. It lasts for about 2 years, and they're trying to throw off the growing imperial yoke. They try to pressure Judah with Ahaz as king to join them. At least the one good thing to say about Ahaz is that Isaiah talks him out of trusting that. The prophecies of Emmanuel in chapter 7 through 9 of Isaiah are in this context of the Syro-Ephraimite War going on around 734 to 732. Israel and Syria have said, okay, we're going to form a political alliance. We're going to try and fight Assyria. It's not going to go well. Judah, you should join us, and we'll be even stronger. Judah doesn't join them, which is part of the reason Judah gets to survive, because when it ends in 732 BC, Assyria just overwhelmingly destroyed both military nations. It causes Israel to become even weaker. Remember, they're already on the downslide for about 20 years, 15 at this point, and but they're decimated both militarily and now economically, because Assyria, what people of yours they're going to let live, are going to tax you and penalize you so harsh. You think paying taxes now is difficult? Assyria came in and said, okay, we're going to take 50% off the top of what you've got. Now as your empire or as your land continues on economically under us, you're going to pay about 35% tribute of all your stuff every year, which means you're living off very little in an already poor society. That the war devastates the land, by the way. And so crops are just destroyed. Most of the crops that they had would go to the soldiers, and then after that, Assyria walks away with your crops to feed its armies down to the next part of the campaign. So you got no food, and a lot of people that survived the battles are now going to starve. And so they're just step by step completely taken down. But they do survive the Syro-Ephraimite War, but they're constantly rebelling against the Assyrian Empire, which basically leads the northern kingdom in 722 to be conquered by Assyria. They say, fine, you're not going to pay tribute, you're going to constantly rebel. Your leaders that we put over you aren't going to submit to us, fine, we'll just come and crush you. And that's what ultimately happens in 722. They tried to move south over the next 20 years into Judah while they're having all these other campaigns consolidating power here. But we've already talked about the fact that in Isaiah's time, through Isaiah's help, even with the good king Hezekiah helping in his faith in the Lord, his trust in him, the southern kingdom, which is not much stronger than the northern kingdom at this point, survives and gets to live on for another 150 years. Any questions on the what or any of this historical, socio-political background?
Well, I had a question about the writing style and the difference.
Okay.
Because it's been a while since I've read the Minor Prophets, but I didn't notice in my English translated Bible a distinction between the Hebrew that Hosea used and wrote with versus what some of his contemporaries did. Is that intentional?
Probably. I mean, I can't speak for the translators because they will help, because Hosea is so outside of the normal. What most translators do that I'm aware of for our English Bibles is that they will try to translate so that it sounds like the rest.
That's what I want.
And there's reasons you can do that in Hebrew.
Okay.
But it comes down to stuff like wordplay, sentence construction, and stuff. Hosea just plays with words a lot.
So you miss the nuances.
So yes, if you're not reading it in Hebrew, and you don't have to, you will miss the nuances. They will try to do that in translations to help smooth it out. I want you to know that, because if you actually get a good study Bible or commentary, they'll make mention of that. They'll help you understand that. And if you ever do actually dive into, or they say this Hebrew word or something, how Hosea plays with words is a little bit different than how anybody else in the Bible plays with words, even though it's still technically wordplay. How he paints pictures are a little bit different, because if you're reading it, it looks like broken Hebrew a little bit, because of the comparisons of how we're just taught Hebrew and used to it because of the Southern dialect. It's really not. It's just a different form of Hebrew. I encountered this maybe 3 weeks ago when I sat down to translate Hebrew Hosea's 1 through 3, because that's the passages we're actually going to dive more intently on. When I got to chapter 2 in particular, I was like, man, I'm not exactly an expert in Hebrew poetry, but this is hard. So why is this hard? Because he's not using words I don't know, but he was shifting all sorts of things around that I didn't quite understand at the time. So for the Hosea lessons that we're going to go through, this is the main book that I'm using by Jerry Huang, a discourse analysis, meaning it breaks the Hebrew down differently, but I wanted to read a couple of summaries of what he says about this, because they're very good. The futility of trusting in power politics rather than the God of Israel came to the fore in 745 BCE, when the window of political opportunity slammed shut with the advent of Tiglath-Pileser III, the famous, or infamous, Assyrian king. The renaissance of Assyria coincided nearly exactly with the passing of Jeroboam II and Uzziah, two long-standing kings of Sumeria and Judah, respectively, whose stable reigns of 5 decades had been the only leadership an entire generation of God's people in both kingdoms had ever known. The rise of Tiglath-Pileser and the demise of Jeroboam II and Uzziah meant that the balance of power in the ancient Near East had shifted radically, and so it seemed that the frightened people of the Israelite kingdoms. As Tiglath-Pileser restarted the Assyrian war machine and his armies rumbled southward toward the eastern Mediterranean, the inhabitants of Samaria and Judah stood directly in the path without proven leadership. So God is working to judge his people in these prophecies that we're going to look at in Hosea, Amos, and Micah in particular. And how is he doing it? Largely through the Assyrian war machine. So something's happening 1,000 miles away, and it's going to, across multiple generations, affect God's people, which I think is actually an interesting way to try to understand what God is doing, because he's not just working in your individual little life. God is always working in bigger things, and those bigger things affect us. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they can wipe away in the blink of an eye everything that you think you know. Or you can trust the Lord and you can persevere, and great political power and great military power can't even touch you. The examples of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom in this first superpower that is Assyria are an example to the collective people of God. What are you going to do if just all around Gladstone and Kansas City, they just turn away from the Lord in droves, and then they start, what happened a couple of months ago with that church that Don Lemon had just busting into the church and interrupting their worship service. What happens if that starts happening? What if people just bust in now and start demanding that things go their way in our community that they're not even a part of, or they at least try to block you from doing it? How are you going to respond? Because their power and stuff and influence is given to them by the Lord, and they might be using it in all the wrong ways. How do you respond? This is actually a good example of this. Learning this history, learning this background, reading these prophecies in light of it all can actually help communities, maybe less so individuals, but communities navigate the frustration of living in a world that rebels against God. So there you go. A little bit more on the what, and then we're going to shift over to the religious what. So that's kind of the socio-political what. So without knowing the specifics of dating, just generally, Hosea's life and ministry and that of all Israel from his lifetime can be broken up, and just think in three large chunks right now. Anything before roughly 750. It's going to be largely good. Imagine Hosea as a kid. He's growing up. Things are nice economically. He becomes a man. The king dies, and then panic starts setting in, right? But up until then, things are largely good, and then things take a turn. The kingdom is getting worse. They're weakening all the time. The increase in political and economic chaos is happening. And now guys like Hosea, Amos, and Micah are saying it actually stems from your idolatry. All of this is happening because you have no loyalty to God. And then you've got 722 and everything after 722 as far as these prophets are concerned. There's no kingdom in the north. The people are gone. Assyria has dispersed them throughout the entire Mediterranean so they can never get back together and cause a rebellion against them. Is Hosea in the south? We don't know. But these are kind of your three big data points. Most of the ministry is happening here, right? So that's where we'll narrow our focus. Now, to finish us off a little bit today, let's talk about Baal worship. This is the primary problem. So this is the religious what. By the time of Hosea and the rest of the writing prophets, a shift had happened in the idolatry adopted by the northern kingdom. Baal worship turns a couple of corners here. Baal was the name of the Phoenician high god of nature, the storm god, the cloud rider. You can go look up the Baal cycle. It comes in two halves, Baal versus Yam, or victorious Baal, and then Baal versus Mot, the god of death. It's the god of the sea and the chaos, and how he has to conquer chaos to create, which is exactly what Genesis 1 is portraying God as doing, as do some of the Psalms. Even the prophets portray God as basically go to war against chaos and win, and the winner gets to establish the world as they see fit. The Baal cycle, victorious Baal over Yam, is the Phoenician high god Baal's version of that. Baal versus Mot is the conquering of death, which would come in handy because the motifs of resurrection that we're celebrating today do stem from places other than the Bible. The Bible is tapping into ideas that existed all around the world and communicating in light of that. As C.S. Lewis and others in the 20th century said, and it bears reminding on Easter Sunday today, Christianity is the myth that came true. It is all of the same mythological themes of every other religion of the ancient Near East, and yet it is a historically defensible reality that God actually did these things. And at the time, he hasn't raised anyone from the dead the way Christ is. So they're struggling with worshiping the Phoenician high god, Baal. He was said to provide all the blessings of rain because he's a storm god, which waters the land and provides food. He's the Zeus of the pantheon, right? In an agrarian society and economy, who actually provides for our survival is the primary question. For the Israelites to answer Baal and not Yahweh was the fundamental breach of the covenant, because the covenant begins, you shall have no other gods besides me, equal to me, on my level. And for them, they're saying, we don't really care about Yahweh, or we're at the very least, we're going to exalt Baal to the same position that we exalt Yahweh. Why? I don't know, just in case. They're hedging. They could be hedging their bets. I'm sure plenty of people were in their own minds hedging their bets. Well, Phoenicia's pretty... Yeah, it's like, well, okay, I know we've always been told that Yahweh marched into Egypt, fought their gods, and drew us out, but, Phoenicia's pretty prosperous up north. Let's take on their gods. And you can it twists because Jeroboam I, when he's the first king of Israel, sets up two golden calves, one in the northern Israel, one in the south. It says, here are your gods. And it was probably Yahweh worship. But Baal was worshipped as a bull. And you can see how they would easily blend these things. Are we worshiping Baal or are we worshiping Yahweh? Do we even know? Let's just worship them both. This is largely the problem during the time of Elijah and Elijah, which are like 150 years before the writing prophets. So they're not the only two prophets. They're just the major ones in Kings. They've been fighting Baal worship and attempting to store Yahweh worship since the kingdom split, since the time of Solomon, really. But it gets underway when the kingdom splits. So, in the 9th century BC, King Jehu of Israel eradicates King Ahab's line. This is Ahab and Jezreel, the infamous kings there. And Ahab and Jezreel, who set up state-sponsored Baal worship officially, is eradicated through Jehu. But it's eradicated at the state-sponsored level. It doesn't mean it goes away. They don't tear down the things of Baal. They just said, okay, we're not officially going to worship Baal anymore. But that just kind of leaves the door open to who are we going to worship? Because Jehu doesn't step in and say, we're going to worship Yahweh. No king of the north didn't do that. So it doesn't end pagan worship in Israel. In some ways, it just confuses and exacerbates it even more. Fast forward 150-ish years, by the time you get to Hosea, Baal worship had turned into worship of a much wider pantheon that fills the void left by primarily this Phoenician high god Baal. Now what Hosea does, and you have to understand this, is he uses the term Baal, not specifically for the Phoenician high god, but as an umbrella term for all the pagan worship that was happening during his time. So again, he's playing on the idea of Baal means Lord in the Hebrew language. I don't really know if that's what it means in Phoenician or if it was just the title applied to their god. But he's using it he could be describing, specific sacred pillars, divining rods, places of worship, tools in worship, the sexual activity involved in worshiping Baal. He could be talking about anything, a lot of different things under this umbrella term. And it's not always clear. To some degree, it would seem that Baal worship proper was making a comeback during Hosea's time, but it wasn't necessarily in vogue, in the zeitgeist of stuff. And so, because people can kind of understand the Baal language and associate pagan things with Baal, Hosea just says, all right, let's just talk about Baal, and he could be talking about just about anything. Regardless of what he's talking about specifically, passage to passage, it's just clear that Hosea is mostly referring to Baal worship as the general term for pagan worship rituals during his lifetime.
In Phoenician, it also means Lord, owner, or husband.
Okay. I figured it must, but I didn't honestly know. Thank you for looking that up. Couple last things. Perhaps we can see the shift of unraveling in the kingdom religiously in the social order because of the religious choices. The social order is one of the purposes of religion throughout human history is that it binds societies and cultures together. That's why you have state-sponsored religions in the ancient world. That's why they come up with their pantheons, and their gods or their kings represent the gods. It does stabilize society socially. Part of the social unraveling of the North this time is because maybe they don't know who they're worshiping. Maybe they're not clear on things. And part of the prophet's mission is we got to make things clear to the people because everything is coming unraveled. So, as the religious order shifted away from refusing to worship Yahweh, but instead focusing on a single pagan god, so this is like Elijah and Elijah's, we're not going to worship Yahweh, we're going to worship Baal, to refusing Yahweh and worshiping lots of pagan gods in synchronization. Look, we'll worship Yahweh, but we're also going to worship Baal, we're also going to worship El, we're also going to worship Mot, we're also going to worship Yam, we're going to worship anything and everything that we want, and we're going to synchronize Yahweh worship with this, completely against the law of Moses. You can see how the society would fracture and turn further away from Yahweh's desire for Israel, and basically makes judgment the only possible path. And this brings us to summarizing Hosea's overall message, which we've already done as we've looked at the other prophets. Because Hosea's prophetical message is fairly typical of all the pre-exilic prophets as a whole. It follows the broad patterns of the preaching of the time. You've broken the covenant with Yahweh, you need to repent before judgment. How have you done that? Well, you're worshiping all these other gods. You're sacrificing your children in the fire. You're cutting yourselves to try and get God's attention. You're doing all these things. You should repent. You're not going to repent? Then the necessary conclusion is the covenant stipulations are going to have to be fulfilled. You're going to have to go into exile. You're going to lose your kingdom. But one day, judgment will come to an end and a glorious time of restoration and renewal will come. Now, I will end with the slide after this, but I can give you 3 eyes for how you can remember most of the prophets, including Hosea's indictments here. And that's a 4th eye if you want it. Idolatry, immorality, and injustice. These are the 3 big I's of the prophets. Idolatry, you have abandoned sole loyalty to God. You have serving other gods. That's wrong. You should not do that. Immorality stems from their religious ritualism. Your supposed loyalty to Yahweh, those of you that worship Yahweh, it's illegitimate because you're worshiping all these other gods, right? He is not going to share your affections with lesser gods, nor will he expect mere ritual towards him to do you any good. You're serving him like he's one of these gods. He's not like these gods. Your worship is illegitimate. Your religious ritualism is bad, especially because how much you're actually defying the Lord sexually to engage in the worship of other gods. And the idolatry and the immorality that comes from serving other gods leads to all of the social abuses and injustices that actually take place in that time. So, you're abusing others, you're exploiting them to benefit yourself, contrary to Yahweh's laws. So let me end here by reading another summary passage from Huang. The metaphor of harlotry can refer variously to sins of sexual immorality found at the Canaanite high places, promiscuity as a shameful lifestyle, and the idolatrous worship practiced in the name of Baal, as well as the unfettered pursuit of prosperity via foreign trade with lovers. So the way that he uses Baal as a umbrella term, he'll use harlotry as an umbrella term to talk about a lot of different things as well. That's all that's saying. For now, it is sufficient to observe that Hosea uses word plays on the multifaceted character of harlotry to encode the urgent message that economic, religious, and political sins had become symbiotic in the 8th century BCE. In other words, sinful structures had been encased in Israel's institution by its leaders to such a wide-reaching extent that systemic sin unavoidably led to individual sin and vice versa. That realization, the realization that human sinfulness worked at multiple levels in ancient Israel, may be counterintuitive for modern readers of Hosea who typically think about sin in individual and compartmentalized terms. So what I'm saying is you're going to have to let go of they're my sins and they're between me and God notion. They are built into society at every level of Hosea's ministry. To understand Hosea, Amos, Micah, and other prophets, you're going to have to understand every level of their society was breached in pagan sin and immorality. A lot like our society today. And keeping it compartmentalized and saying, well, it's just between me and God, ain't gonna help. You're going to have to extend your ideas about sin and redemption beyond the personal to the social. And if we can do that, well, we're going to be on good terms to actually walk with God as a community, regardless of where we're at individually.